Go ahead and get started. Pete's here now.
I'm here, you can start. All the important people are here.
All right. Everybody's in shock because it's actually 6:31 and we are starting.
Breaking tradition.
Yeah, how about that? We'll go back to it next week, don't worry. Right. That's right. No doubt about that. I know it was with my family on certain things like holidays and certain things. Usually. It is true on Sunday, you can scan the crowd because we are creatures of habit. We usually sit in the same area. And you can tell when people walk in and someone's in that seat. They don't get upset. I haven't seen anybody fight. But they're like, oh, man. And they give that look, All right. Glenn, why don't you open us in prayer?
Father, thank you for bringing us out tonight on this beautiful day that we've had today. And we thank you and praise you for every good day that you give us. We thank you for our lives. We thank you for our salvation, Lord. And we thank you for this church that we can come to and praise and worship you, Father. We just ask you to bless our time together tonight. Bless Larry as he speaks. Bless each and every family represented here. I pray for those people who are fighting through sicknesses and stuff, Father. I ask that you would heal those people and bring us all back as one beautiful, happy church, Lord. Again, bless our time together tonight. Help us to learn something. Help us to take it with us and remember it and apply it to our lives so that we can go out and make mature disciples, Father.
Amen.
That's our job. That's what we're here for. And I pray that you would do that, that you would enable us and help us to do that. Help us all to be better servants of yours, Father, to be better disciples and better witnesses. Help us to be bold in our speaking. Help us to speak up when we know we should and to do right. Again, we just thank you for tonight. Bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay, I forgot to silence my phone, so I better do that right now because as sure as anything, somebody will call or something, or text, yes. Well, last week we looked at Nahum, and we were 2 weeks. And last week, if you remember, as we talked about Nahum, the chapter 1 is all about God's character. I don't know if you had a chance. I know I went back this week and read it a couple times, and just to rehearse all that character of God and who He is. What a gracious and kind God, as we looked at. But we also made a point that I just want to bring up from was it last week or the week before? Because was last week did we have service Wednesday? Was it last week we did Nahum? Okay. Is that we gave that illustration of the frog in the pot. I think we all kind of understood that, how that it wasn't fighting to get out. It wasn't trying to get out. He was comfortable in the surroundings he was. And that's what Nahum's trying to push here, is that God is a jealous God. God's a loving God. God's a just God. God's long-suffering. But there was a line that was crossed. And God said that was it. It didn't matter what what Nineveh was going to do then. God said they would be judged now. And same thing that happened with Israel and also Judah. God said that they would be judged for their disobedience. They separated from God, and whenever you separate from something, you always go to something else. You like if you separate to God, you have to then separate from something to separate to God, and that's what they did. They separated from God. They made new idols. They disregarded all that God and the goodness of Him over those years, as that generation evidently died, grew older, and was dropping off the scene, and there was no leader to replace, maybe someone strong to help keep people together into teaching, I'm not sure, but they separated themselves onto something else. So we ended that by saying, Nahum said, "You have forgotten Jehovah." That's where we left off. They've forgotten Jehovah. Chapter 1 reminds us of who is beautifully written, that's beautifully written in poetry, but the bottom line was, when we got to the end, is they had forgotten Jehovah. And then we said this week we would cover chapter number 2 and chapter number 3. And so that's our intentions to do that. Okay, so God says, time is up. Time is up. It was clear that Nahum's time was up. Now, when God says that the time was up and he was pronouncing the judgment, it did not happen right away. It happened over time. I want to let you know also, and I forgot this book that I was going to bring tonight. It is biblical history. It's in 5 volumes, and a lot of learning about the nation of Nineveh I found in there. It would have taken a lifetime to figure out what this gentleman has written in these 5 volumes. It's just an incredible amount of historical data. So a lot of what I'm going to say is certainly out of there. I don't think one person could learn it in a week's time or really understand some of the results of God judging Nineveh. So just to let you know that ahead of time. So God says time is up. Nahum's poetry blazes across the pages, but it's not just poetry, it's truth. Don't get lost in the beauty of the language. Don't get lost in the beauty of his words and how he pulls things together. But what he's doing is that's his style of writing, but it is truth. God always deals in truth. Always. Aren't you glad? When we see, thus saith the Lord, we don't question it. We try to understand it. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to us. We're trying to figure it all out. But there's no doubt about it that it's absolute truth. And it's a great book to have. Some people have told me that they do not use any commentaries or anything. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's going too far. I think that if you can find someone that's trusted, like I used today, this man that did all this research, he spent his whole life writing these volumes of books. And I'll get the name of it and send it to you guys. They're worth having on your shelf. They help you understand. I'm so thankful for their labor because you can't be an expert in everything, and they help. And so commentaries can help. There's no doubt about that. Well, Nahum 1:3, that was the verse that we looked at, and I think we're going to look at that and 2:10 and then jump in to this second part. Nahum 1:3, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. In other words, God is loving. But if God's just loving, he's not really a God for us. He's not only loving, but he's just. He's just. In other words, he will carry out his justice in a fair way. In a fair way. So the Lord slow to anger, and he will not acquit wicked. And the Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storms, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. God's in control of everything. He is the Lord of hosts. He's in charge of everything. He's over everything. And then Nahum 2:10 tells us the sad verse in chapter 2 that talks about Nineveh. So he's talking about Nineveh now in 2:10 directly. He says, she is empty. What do you think about when you think about empty? Gone? What? Your stomach, yeah. So when you think about something, so she's empty. All of her glory and beauty, and every nation has glory and every nation has beauty, it's all gone. It's empty. It's bottomed out. It's void. It says she is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain in all the loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. There was just no hope. Everything was sucked out of it. This nation that God would use to judge them, which was once again was Babylon, but he uses them. But what takes place there? Just there's everything is just sucked out. Just all the oxygen is taken out. There is clearly no hope. There are some things that we can neglect that you can fix. Let's say you don't take care of your yard, or a patch of your yard or whatever, and you neglect. Well, here we got a guy that works on yards. So you neglect the yard. You can always go out and you can rototiller that, or you can get it all torn up, and you can put down black dirt again, and you can replant the seed, and you can recover a lawn. You can recover. So there's other things that you could give an example that you could neglect. You can not clean a room for a while, and then you can clean it and get it back to where it should be. So there are some things that you can neglect, but they can be fixed. But Nineveh neglected their relationship with God. And that was huge. And they allowed their moral standards to erode. They crossed a line that could not be recovered. Now, God is long-suffering, and so God did not come in one day and say, hey, this is over, and there was the whirlwind. There was no. He kept warning them. God is like that. He does that in your life. God chastens you. He doesn't send a trial into your life necessarily to make your faith genuine. The rejection of applying that truth that he's trying to get you to apply, eventually he chastens us. That's because he loves us, and it's not pleasant. But there is a time, like the Bible says, where I am not going to deal with them anymore. I'm going to give them the leanness of their soul. This is what they want. I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to give them the leanness of their soul. They want a king so bad, a king they're going to get. And so there's times that we cross that line. There really can be. The Bible says there's a sin unto death. I do not say what that sin is. There can be a time where we cast our pearls so much in front of the swine that God takes us home early. Early dismissal at school is great. At work too. Right. You might be saying early dismissal from you talking right now. Might be good. But, because you can get long-winded. But dismissal from serving the Lord when really there was more to give. But we just did not what we should not do. In fact, Matthew chapter 7, verse number 6 says, give not that which is holy unto the dogs. Dogs back there are not like dogs today. I mean, today they have PetSmart. I mean, most dogs don't know they're dogs today. They think they're part of the family. But back then, dogs were regarded as not a good thing. Wild, out of control. Go ahead. Scavengers, and so on. And so it says, give not which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine. That's some imagery there, isn't it? Lest they trample them under their feet and turn against and rent you. America's judgment is the weight of their own sin that is imploding the foundation of God's ways. So as we look at today and we try to relate this to where we are today, some people say, well, why isn't God judging? Why isn't God judging? Why isn't God judging in a way that we want him to judge? It's kind of like what Habakkuk said. But America is under the judgment of God. We're imploding by kicking him out of the nation. The weight of our own sin is our chastisement. Look at it. We see it just tearing our nation apart, this absolute ridiculous anti-God behavior. Careless churches have expedited this judgment. We can't move 3 feet behind the world and call that holiness. So in other words, the world's here, and then there's a group called the world, and under the kingdom of the world, and they're doing things that are wrong, and so they keep moving downward, and so we're here where we should be, and so we move 1 foot towards them. We look holier than them because of look at what they're doing. But look how far we've moved from where we should be. We're not to move, so we move as they move. So the farther they get, we still look pretty good in our own eyes. And that's what God is saying, I think, in America, is that you're moving with them. It's just that you're staying 3 feet behind them, so you look pretty good. And so the careless church is expediting this judgment as well. We are to be the voice. Where are the Nahums? Where are the Gideons? Where are the ones that are standing, not out of pride, but standing where they should? So in Nahum chapter 1, verse number 14, and the Lord had given a command concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown. Out of the house of thy God will I cut off the graven images and the molten images. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. That's what he's talking about in Nineveh. They exchanged Jehovah for different gods. Isn't it amazing when we change God for another God, it's something we can touch and feel? It could be money, could be our pride, our own pride. It could be actually building a god, a stone god, or it could be in our spouse. Our God could be ourselves. Something that we can see and touch and feel. And that's what they did here. It was evident of this in Nahum 1:14 tells us that. Now, as we jump into chapter number 2 in our book here in Nahum, in chapter number 2, verse number 1. Let me turn my page here. So I'm looking at this. Whoops. Oh, so far down here to bend. That's how you know that you're getting a little older. It says in chapter 2, verse number 1, he that dasheth in pieces is come up before thy face. Keep thy munitions, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily. So what he's saying here is that he that dashes in pieces has come up before you. So in other words, the Lord is coming. And what he's saying is keep the munition, watch the way. So in other words, he's coming. I mean, it isn't, is God coming? The signs are all there. You better be looking, because any day now, I am going to destroy Nineveh and those that live in it. So he's saying, you know what? He's coming down the street at any moment. God, just the way that we anticipate the coming of the Lord in a good way, this is the coming of God to judge. And he's telling you, I don't care how powerful you are, what you are, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily, because I am coming. I am coming to destroy. God is in pursuit of Nineveh because they have replaced him. Don't replace God. Now, he's talking to believers here, because we know of the revival that took place just a few books ago, or 100 years ago. So we're now not talking to a heathen nation that probably doesn't have a clue what he's saying, thinking their gods are stronger. He is saying, hey, you have tasted the sweetness of me, and I am now pursuing because you have replaced me. Nineveh fortified herself for safety. Many countries did that, nations did that, but she did it to the nth degree. Now, this is where I got a lot of this out of this book, and I'll give you it was a wonderful read. I'm so thankful for this gentleman or this group of men that wrote this. Nineveh fortified herself for safety. The walls were 100 feet high. So I'm trying to realize that in my mind. 3 feet, a yard is 3 feet, right? So I'm figuring, what is that, 30 some? So it's three first downs. Yes, it's high. And so the walls were wide enough for 4 chariots to ride next to each other. So chariots are large. 4 chariots could jostle together across the top of this. So you can see the amount of safety they were trying to put together. The walls were in circumference. Now, this one was hard for me to find out. Kept Googling distances to try to get to this. But the walls were a circumference of 80 miles. That would be about from here to O'Hare was 42 miles, just saying from Hampshire to O'Hare, not from an exact address. 42, so it would be there and back. That's the circumference of the walls, were 80 miles. That's a lot of brick and stone and mortar. Probably. So you can see the strength of this city. Certainly, if I was going to attack that city, I would be thinking, oh my goodness, how do we get into this? This was huge. There was 1,200 defense towers. So across that 80 miles, every so often there was a tower, a place where it was being watched. There was a moat 140 feet wide and 60 feet deep surrounding the vast walls. So not only that, there was a moat. I don't know what was in the moat, but there was something that was preventing some water there as another line of defense. But Nineveh forgot God, and under King Sargon and his sons, and then also under Shalmaneser and Sennacherib, the great nation was built, and the Lord threw it down with a stroke of his will. It didn't matter how powerful they were. It didn't matter that they had 80 miles of circumference around them. It doesn't matter that 4 chariots could ride across the top. It did not matter that when God chooses, it doesn't matter what you have or what you're depending on, God in a swipe of a moment can tear down anything that we have. So the poetic picture of this fall of the city is found then in Nahum 2, chapter 2, verses 2 through 10. I'll read 2 and you read 3, and we'll kind of read a little bit of this poetry of this nation falling. For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob and the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers have emptied them out and marred their vine branches. So this is a sign there. Red was a color for this nation that they found important. And these mighty men and all in chariots they had, everything they had, it was nothing. It was no defense against the Lord. And then in verse number 4, the chariots shall rage in the streets. They got confused. They raged in the street because, see, no one's supposed to be inside the walls. They were raging in the streets. They jostled one with another in the broad ways, and they seemed like torches. They shall run like the lightning. They were fearful. They were trying to get away. It was every man and woman for themselves. Okay, verse 5. The gates of the river shall be open, and the palace shall be destroyed. So the picture here is this moat. Somehow, as the walls crumble, the moat comes in, the water, whatever was in there. I don't know how God did it or how this was all done, but it pushed the walls in. It pushed the walls in. The water did. That was around them for protection ended up being a terrible thing. And then verse number 7. Let me just tell you, the Husbub is the central think tank. It would be the leadership of the nation there. It would be the ones that would probably, the generals and the people that probably hold the power. Go ahead. But Nineveh is old like a pool of water, yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, but none shall look back. In other words, they were fleeing. Nobody was fighting anymore. It was too much. They were being killed, and they were fleeing the place. Okay, and then of course we had read. You don't need to read 9. Go ahead and read 10. All right, let's try to make this relevant to us. We can't imagine in our minds America just being swept away that quickly. We're so powerful. We are. We're a very powerful nation. And this nation was powerful like that. And look, in just a moment of time, when God's judgment had fallen upon them, it happened. No matter how much you have, no matter what you have. So complete was the judgment of God on Nineveh that the existence of the city literally disappeared. In other words, over time, it wasn't, well, let me just finish this because this is out of that book where I'm reading here. It wasn't until 2 Englishmen in 1845 in a dig discovered evidence of the city of Nineveh, the region of it. It was believed that Nineveh was a mystical city and the story of Jonah was fictional because they couldn't find the city. In fact, Napoleon went right across it and didn't even know it was Nineveh. King Alexander, when he battled and he took most of the nation, he didn't realize that was Nineveh. He just thought it was formations of rocks. And you can see how God destroyed everything. There was no thought anymore of the Assyrians. And then in 1845 to actually 1854, the dig started and they began to bring up things and were able to capture this data or figure out a little bit about this city. It was believed that Nineveh was a mystical city and the story of Jonah was fictional. So let's look at a couple principles. What God does is always finality. When God does it, he always does it right. When he judged Nineveh, he judged them completely. But I looked at that also. That's the negative, but the positive is this. Aren't you glad our salvation is finality? As much as God judged these people, still we think of that today, but God's work on the cross through his Son was finality, and we're secure in him. What a great principle to know. Second is America, from George Washington to President Biden. So we're looking at the start of the nation, we'll say, with George Washington. We'll just use that as a thing. And we'll come all the way up to today. Our president is President Biden. So we'll look at those bookends there. And with all that we have, I mean, we have a very strong nation. We have a way of painting a little window on a building 2,000 miles away. They paint it. I don't know how they do all that. Maybe you guys know a little bit more than that. And they shoot a missile, and the missile goes inside that window, and then it goes down and breaks apart the building completely. They can do that without putting a human being there. They have drones. They have radar or planes that can hide from the radar. You can launch from here a nuclear holocaust. It's just incredible all that we have. And so we're kind of like Nineveh in that way. But God says, just with the stroke of his hand, it's like brushing dust away. And we think we're all that. And we're not. Thank you. We're not. Our security is not in our missiles. Our safety is in the Lord. Safety in the Lord. So those are principles there. Let's not get, just because we're America, we're okay. No, we're not okay. A country could come in here and invade us tomorrow if God chose it to be that. I'm glad he's long-suffering with us. And in Nahum 2:13 says, "Behold, I am against thee." Could you imagine the Lord saying to you, "I'm against you"? You say, "Well, I can't believe he would say that." Well, he does. He says in James that if you're prideful, it says, "God resisteth the pride." So if you're prideful, or when pride creeps up, God's against you. Saith the Lord of hosts, "I will burn her chariots in the smoke. And the sword will devour the young lions, and I will cut off thy prey." Those young lions are not actually talking about physical beast. They're talking about the military, the strength, the men, their bestiality. They were a well-trained military. "And I'll cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messenger shall no more be heard." And is that not true? They were gone, wiped. And then when we get to chapter number 3 is interesting. It rehashes the downfall, the reasons why God chose to do this to this city. And it'll be a good read for you. We won't cover it all. But it says, "Woe to the bloody city. It's all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not." This is what they were. "The noise of a whip and the noise of a rattle of the wheels and the prancing horses and the jumping chariots." They were full of themselves. God was far from them. They were very prideful people. "The horsemen lift up both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there is multitudes they're slain." They would lay the carcasses of the people they would slain outside the gates, and they were just an unbelievable country because of the multitudes of their whoredom and their well-favored harlots, the mistress of witchcrafts that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcraft. All of this is what God's against. This is what he's saying. This is why I judge them. This was actively taking place in the nation of Assyria. And you can read them as you go on and on and on. In verse number 6, "And I will cast abominable filth upon thee, and make thee vile, and will set thee as a gazing stock. And it shall come to pass that all they that look upon thee shall flee from thee, and say, Nineveh is laid waste." Because they were such a powerful country. They were a world leader. They were dominant. Who will bemoan her? When shall I seek comforters for thee? So he goes on and he just talks about how they were judged because of their terribleness, so to say. They're joining to heathen gods and a worship that was outside of what God says should be. Now the book of Nahum is brief. It's 79 verses. It's only 3 chapters. You get through it really quick. The book is brief. We will end here because we want to keep. It's like the thrust of the dagger is clear because they forgot Jehovah. We could go through these things verse by verse and peel them apart about how awful they were and how they had all these gods. But the bottom line is if you try to put it underneath one title, they left Jehovah. They left God. How about us? How about America? Yeah, there's a promise. Always a promise at the end that we'll get to in our little video. And they exchanged their separation from the world for the world again. God pulled them out and showed them that God was willing to save them. God was willing to restore them. God was able to be their God. And over 100 years, they separated from that to go back to the world again. May this quick destruction remind us to wake up and get busy. It's time to wake up. Time is short. Not only is it short because of our ages, because we're getting older every day, it's not only time because of that, and also that the Lord may come back, but the other thing too is, will we even have a nation if we continue the way we are? What opportunities we have today. We get to go out and share our faith wherever we go. We're able to meet tonight. Nobody is pressing upon the building to stop us from meeting. That might not be the case in a year or 2 from now, or 3 years or 5 years. But right now it is, and we need to strike while opportunity is here. Get busy. Time is short. There's no time to waste. There's no time to waste. Don't waste time. 2 thoughts as we end. Because of God's character, we are to take God seriously. We're to take him seriously. What is that? What do you think we mean when we say that? Because of God's character, we're to take God seriously. What should we take serious? Yeah, we're to take that serious. Going out, spread. What else should we take seriously? Separation from the world. What else should we take seriously? Righteousness. How about our relationships with one another? We should take those seriously. Yeah, our salvation. I mean, it was paid with a deep price. I mean, God gave all. God gave all. So God's character, we're to take things seriously. We need to make a mature disciple so others will return to righteousness. Let us be reminded of the illustration of the frog in the pot. He was oh so comfortable. How comfortable are you? We're so comfortable. We demand so much from the church for our comfortability. And if a church doesn't have certain things, then we don't want to be part of it. But we're at war. We're not here to be comfortable. We're only here to meet so we can go out and fight the battle. We're not here. This is not where we're supposed to hang out all week. We're supposed to come here and huddle. We're supposed to come here and get encouraged. We're to share one another with each other. And then we are to go out and face the world and proclaim righteousness, the righteousness of Christ. Number 2, because of God's supreme power, we are to fear God in a biblical way. We're not to be walking around in fear of God in the sense of an ungodly fear, like, I'm afraid to say anything, I'm afraid. No, not that type of, but we're to realize that God is God. Look what he can do. If we do, it will be the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the what? The beginning of knowledge, it says in Proverbs. Of him, so we will follow him wholeheartedly. if we really understand that, God gave all. He's serious about this called out assembly of believers to carry out his plan, not our plan. We're not here to carry out, we're not here for treasure. We're not here to stock up as much as we can. We're here to spend all and to be spent for him. And we've been fortunate in America. God has not only given us liberty to preach, but he's given us homes, and he's given us grocery stores with food, and he's given us microwaves, and, cell phones, and cell towers. I love all that. I'm so glad that we have all that. I'm glad that we can have a home. I'm glad that we can, have what we have. That's fantastic. But don't let it slip away where we're not following him wholeheartedly. We're just so comfortable that we're like the proverbial frog. Yeah, we come to church, but that's about it. We're to be very active in the field constantly. We have such a wrong view of God because he is so long-suffering that we just really think that God's really not going to judge us. But he might already be judging us. Okay, so that's Nahum. Now, we have our little video, and it's a good video on the book of Nahum. And have it here on the computer. Turn on our...
The book of the prophet Nahum. This short prophetic book is a collection of poems announcing the downfall of one of Israel's worst oppressors, the ancient empire of Assyria, and its capital city, Nineveh. The Assyrians arose as one of the world's first great empires, and their expansion into Israel resulted in the total destruction and exile of the northern kingdom and its tribes. The Assyrian armies were violent and destructive on a scale that the world had never seen before, and so Israel and its neighbors were awaiting the downfall of Assyria, which eventually came in the year 612 BC. The Babylonians rose up and began a rebellion that overtook Nineveh and brought down the Assyrian Empire. And so chapter 2 depicts the fall of Nineveh in vivid poetry, and chapter 3 then explores the downfall of the empire as a whole. But this book isn't just an angry tirade against Israel's enemies. The introductory chapter shows us that there is way, way more going on here. The book opens with an incomplete alphabet poem that begins by describing a powerful appearance of God's glory. It's very similar to how the previous book, Micah, began and how the next book, Habakkuk, is going to conclude. And it's God, the all-powerful creator, coming to confront the nations and bring his justice on their evil. And the poem opens by quoting from the famous line of God's self-description after the golden calf incident in the book of Exodus chapter 34. The Lord is slow to anger. He's great in power. He won't leave evil unpunished. And so the rest of the poem goes back and forth, contrasting the fate of the arrogant, violent nations with the fate of God's faithful remnant. When God brings down all the arrogant empires, he will provide refuge for those who humble themselves before him. Now, here's what's really interesting, is that you thought this book was only about Assyria, but Nahum actually nowhere mentions Nineveh or Assyria in chapter 1. And when he describes the downfall of the bad guys, he uses Isaiah's language about the fall of Babylon, which happened much later in history. And not only that, Nahum also describes the downfall of the bad guys as good news for the remnant of God's people. It's a direct allusion to Isaiah's good news about the downfall of Babylon. And so all these little details from chapter 1, they come together to make a key point. For Nahum, the fall of Nineveh is being presented as an example, as an image of how God is at work in history in every age, how he won't allow the arrogant or violent empires of our world to endure forever. And so the message of Nahum is actually very similar to that of Daniel. Assyria stands in a long line of violent empires throughout history, and Nineveh's fate is a memorial to God's commitment to bring down the violent and the arrogant in every age. With this perspective from the opening chapter, the book then returns to its focus on Assyria. And so chapter 2 describes the Battle of Nineveh and the overthrow of the city in progressive stages. So first we see the front line of Babylonian soldiers, and then we read about the charge of the chariots, and then the chaos on the city walls as the city is breached, then the slaughter of Nineveh's people, then the plundering of the city. Chapter 3 goes on to describe the results of the city's downfall for the empire as a whole. So Nahum begins by announcing a woe upon the city whose kings built it with the blood of the innocent. It's an image of how injustice was built into the very system that made Assyria so successful. But their violence has sown the seeds of their own destruction, and so Assyria will fall before Babylon. The book concludes with a taunt against the fallen king of Assyria. He's stricken with a fatal wound, and from among all the nations that he once oppressed, no one comes to help him. Rather, they sing and celebrate his destruction. And that's how the book ends. Now, this is a gloomy book, but it's important to see how Nahum's message addresses the tragic and perpetual cycles of human violence and oppression in every age. Human history is filled with tribes and nations elevating themselves and using violence to take what they want, resulting in the death of the innocent. And the book of Nahum uses Assyria and Babylon as examples to tell us that God is grieved and that he cares about the death of the innocent and that his goodness and his justice compel him to orchestrate the downfall of oppressive nations. And God's judgment on evil is good news, unless, of course, you happen to be Assyria. Which brings us all the way back to the conclusion of that opening poem in chapter 1, which tells us that the Lord is good and a refuge in the day of distress. He cares for those who take refuge in him. And so the little book of Nahum invites every reader to humble themselves before God's justice and to trust that in his time he will bring down the oppressors of every time and place. And that's what the book of Nahum is all about.
True. Yeah.
9/11 happened, and you saw the people in the Middle East celebrating what was going on. That wasn't deserved, in terms of our place in the world, but in the eyes of God. Exactly. I mean, they did then, probably more now. But we've gotten further from God, so why would we be surprised by that?
And then, like, you made an analogy earlier about, like, we think we are so above all that we can't be destructive. But then, in my business, I see a little insect that can take down a 90-foot tree
Oh,
in a year, right? So when I see God can create this little bug that's this big, and just 5 of them can take down a 90-foot, 60-year-old tree in a year and a half, what do you think God can do to evil?
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to him. Well, I know this, that right now, there's still opportunity here, and let's not miss Mr. Opportunity. We don't know when opportunity will leave, and we need to strike while it's here. And I know that generations have been saying that long before me as well, and the Lord has been gracious to our nation, but let's strike while we can, in a good way for the Lord.
Well, I think the great news is in there too. He talks about the righteous, in chapter 1.
Yeah,
And
right,
in other parts of the other stories of the Bible,
right.
he talks about the righteous.
Yeah, well, God's got the right plan. I want to be on the Lord's side, don't you? I want to be fighting the way He's fighting. I want to be going where He's going. That's what the whole month of January is about. I can say this here, but I'll say it again, is that, there's no way we can know 100% for sure what we ought to do as a church. I mean, there's no way. but God does set principles that we can follow that will always lead us in the right direction until he shows his hand completely. And that's what we want to do as a church. We have goals. We have ambitions. There's things that we feel the Lord's leading in a certain way. And but we're going to follow those principles, which we'll talk about over these next 2 weeks of Vision Sunday. We're going to follow those because there's safety in following God's principles. And men and women in the scriptures have done that. And the ones that have, whether they saw the fullness of it or not, they took the gospel further. And that's what we want to do. We want to take the gospel as far as we can and take all that God will allow us to do in the generation that we're in. So we're preparing for rain because we know God's doing something. We're just not sure exactly how he's going to lay that all out. I wish I did. It'd be really nice if he just kind of sent down a little envelope and we opened it up and there was like a little DVD and we just gathered church together and say, hey, God sent this. And we all watched it and said, oh, this is great. But it works on faithfulness to what we already know, then exposes what will come next. God will give more light as we move forward, and we'll kind of develop that over this week. Now, one thing before we go to prayer, don't turn around, and don't look over there, because it's like, don't touch the paint, it's wet. What is our theme? Accountable to God. Does anybody know the verse? Genesis 1:1, can you say it? That's it. That's our theme. That's what we're going to pound on all year. We're going to try to make sure that we know that there is a creator. He has a plan, and he's for us, and we just need to be accountable to him. We're accountable. You know, when no one's accountable to anybody, you know what happens. It just goes crazy. All the rules change. Everything gets out. God's a God of order. I mean, all the scriptures order. It's order, 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 order. God is not fickle. Go ahead. You're thinking. Your mind's going. Yeah. 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 And Satan is trying to teach us that disorder is okay. It's not. He does it all the way from creation, where God says things go from order to disorder, and Satan says things go from disorder to order. The Big Bang, or, whatever, that you can take a watch and crush it all up and throw it up in the air, and over billions of years it'll come down and be a fine timepiece. And it doesn't work like that. Things go from order to disorder. And Satan wants us to believe that we're getting better, that we're accomplishing things. Look at what we can do today. We can microwave a hot dog in 40 seconds. Look how far we've come. And, of course, we know that it's the opposite. But God's a God of order, and we want to be a church of order, spiritual order. Okay, well, we'd like to pray, and so we have about 10 or so minutes. Pete, did you want to just talk about your wife's aunt?
Yes, thank you. Kate's aunt Marilyn passed away this morning. She's been in hospice for a while. She got a call last night that we needed to get there today. So we were planning on heading up there this morning, but 4 o'clock her aunt died, and we obviously didn't go to Wisconsin today. Katie had witnessed to her at length numerous times. She was steeped in her